And welcome back to episode 34 of Backhouse Productions, our newest guest, Kloock. So I just want to say thank you for responding to our email. Because, we kind of just shoot it in the dark and kind of hope for a response. But the reason we wanted to have you on was we saw that you're a professor at CSUB. You're a biology professor.
Yep.
Kind of just talk about how you got into that. Like, how did you start off going down that path?
Okay. Well, to be honest, I pretty much started that when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I was always interested in biology, particularly interested in predator-prey interactions. Like to go out and watch my cat hunt gophers and squirrels and birds and whatnot. And so just had that interest from very early on. And then when I went to college, I was like, okay, what are the different things I can do? And I'll be honest, I made a decision for probably one of the worst reasons you can think of making a decision, because I was trying to decide whether I wanted to go into aeronautical engineering or into zoology. And so I ended up being a semifinalist for an Air Force ROTC scholarship. And so my decision was basically if I won the scholarship, I was going to go into engineering, and if I didn't, I was going to go into zoology.
Wow.
So I didn't get the scholarship, so I went into zoology.
Okay.
And that's kind of how I started my undergrad stuff.
Nice. So what school did you go to?
I went to UC Davis.
UC Davis, yeah. Nice. UC school.
Bachelor's of zoology from UC Davis, and a master's in ecology from there, and then my PhD at Michigan State.
So when you say you were interested in watching your cat kind of pray and hunt someone down or animal down, do you? I kind of think of survival of the fittest a little bit. I mean, yeah. I'm just kind of piecing things together for biology wise from my from what I know. And what I was reading from you was me and JP were talking about earlier about your literacy tests, about do people with a general education in science, do they actually have the natural or the knowledge to actually have a conversation about it or actually know what are the disciplines and
so
science?
That's some work I got involved in much later in my career. So I was involved with a group of professors from several different California State University campuses. We had people from Channel Islands and Monterey Bay, and I don't remember all the other ones. It's been a few years. And we got together and basically said, okay, what should a person who is literate in science know and be able to do? And out of that grew this instrument that you're talking about, the Science Literacy Concept Inventory, that is now being administered all over the country to try and get a gauge for whether programs are achieving the goals of science literacy or not. So we use it at CSUB to monitor our general education program. And the results from that have shown a lot of stuff, and generally shows that to kind of achieve the level that we'd like to see as a general level of literacy in science, it takes about 4 college-level classes to get people up to that level. A lot of the general education programs in the country, quite frankly, don't quite get there, including ours. We only require 3. So we'd like to get another one in there, but we don't have enough units for it.
Yeah, when I was at Fresno State, I only took one. It was a biology class, and when I took this biology class, I used a lot of Chegg. Do you know what that is?
Sorry,
do you know what Chegg is?
I do not.
You don't know what Chegg is? All right, I'm going to spill the beans here. So Chegg is, you get an assignment. I can use my phone. I can scan a question, and it will give me an answer to everything. Basically,
hopefully you're not using it during the test.
You can if you want to, if they're online. If they're administered online, that's a lot of fun. But yeah, think about that. So how do you you really have never heard of Chegg before?
No.
Damn, all right. Well, sorry, students.
I know there are things like that out there, but I don't know that particular one.
How do you combat that? Knowing, or do you even give your assignments online? Or are you?
In general, yeah, we give tests in person and we watch to make sure people aren't using their phones and that sort of stuff. So, you try and keep that down, doing it that way. During the pandemic, things were a little bit different. Basically, what I did in most of my classes was I told my students, yeah, you can go use those things. And I wrote my exams in such a way that finding answers to a lot of this stuff wasn't very likely, because I'd give them novel scenarios and have them figure out the answer. And so it's a lot less likely that you can go online and find something that the answer is just sitting there.
That's probably the worst feeling, is when you don't study for a test and you're trying to find the answers and nothing's popping up.
Yeah.
It's awful.
Been there a time or two, not going to lie.
So how long have you been teaching at CSUB?
Say that again.
How long have you been teaching at CSUP?
I started there in 2001.
Okay. And did you start, your first time was there, or did you come from somewhere else?
No, I taught at a university in Maryland called Towson University for 2 years before I came out here.
Okay, so you're not originally from Bakersfield?
No.
No, okay. Where are you from?
I'm a military brat, so I'm from a lot of different places. I was actually born at George Air Force Base, not that far away from here.
Okay.
Okay, nice.
Lived in California, Hawaii, Wisconsin. I was growing up.
Okay, so for someone, let's say for a layman like me and JP, can you explain what are the fundamentals of biology?
The fundamentals of biology.
Yeah, just kind of breaking it down.
First thing I'm going to say is that biology is a really broad field.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ask 10 different biologists what the fundamentals are, they're probably going to branch off into their own field. So probably the most fundamental things about biology, in my opinion, would be evolution. An understanding of evolution really informs your ability to understand everything else in biology. To somebody who's more of a cell biologist, I happen to be an ecologist, but somebody who's more of a cell biologist, they would probably channel that into understanding of cell biology, in particular understanding of genetics. Genetics provides one of the key things for evolution, so you can see those things in there. Yeah.
What do you do your genetics? Do they obviously form from the environment that someone is living in, right?
Not really. I mean, it depends on how you want to phrase that. Your genetics are, you get those from your parents, okay? But your parents got them from their parents, and all of that is influenced by the environment, not that you're in now, but that your ancestors were in.
It's a slow process.
So when we look at evolution, there are really two key parts and one sort of key part to evolution. So the two key things are, first of all, heredity. That is, inheriting traits from your parents, your ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
The other is variation. Okay, so when we look around at any species, doesn't matter what, you'll notice that there's variation, right? Different heights, different skin colors, different hair colors, right? All these different things. When you look at rabbits, you'll see similar stuff. Obviously the traits are different, but there's still variation. And so when you have those two things there, when you have variation and you have heredity, well, then what we're going to see is that organisms can change over time, or species can change over time, their characteristics can change over time. If we add a third thing to that, which is called differential selection, okay? All differential selection means, basically, is that the variation matters, right? So if some individuals have a variation that allows them to survive better in the environment, right? So, imagine, I didn't bring props with me, so, you've got this nice red tablecloth.
Yeah.
Okay. So imagine you had some sort of bug that this was their environment, they were living in this.
Mm-hmm.
And there was variation in these bugs, and some of them were red, and some of them were blue. And a predator comes along to try and eat these guys. Which ones are they going to see better?
Blue. The blue one.
Blue. So which ones are going to get eaten more?
The blue.
The blue. Which ones are going to survive more?
The red.
What's going to happen to the percentage of red individuals in the population over generations?
It's going to increase.
We're going to see evolution happen, right? Because evolution is just a change in the frequency of traits over generations. So as we do that over generations, if we did that in this case, after, I don't know, depends on how bad the predation was and stuff, but after 5, 10, maybe 20 generations, you'd probably find a situation where the blue ones were gone entirely.
So does that variation, does that come arbitrary? Is that random? Is it?
In a sense, yes. I mean, when we think about it theoretically, yeah, it's this random variation. In reality, of course, all the variation in a species at any one point in time is the result of a lot of the selections that's happened in the past. So it's not completely random. Mm-hmm. And that's really where the differential selection portion comes into play. That gives you the non-random part of evolution, right? One of the common misconceptions about evolution is that it's random. There are types of evolution that are random. And for this thing, I don't want to get too much into things like genetic drift and stuff like that, but we can talk about that if you want. The type of evolution I'm talking about is evolution via the mechanism of natural selection, okay? And natural selection is where we get that thing, differential selection. Right? Mm-hmm. Some individuals survive better than others. If that's going on in a population, then the changes that you're going to see in that population aren't random. They're going to be predictable from the environment, from knowing what's going on in the environment. My simple example here, You're able to predict, oh, red's going to increase. Of course they will.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty straightforward. There's nothing fancy about that, as long as that variation is heritable.
So could those blue bugs, though, could they migrate to a region that perhaps is not or more suitable for them?
Exactly. Say we had another table over there that had a blue tablecloth, right? We do the same experiment on that table, you're going to end up with a bunch of blue beetles instead of a bunch of red beetles. And if, I'm a biologist who comes along and I study beetles, and I find this population of red beetles and that population of blue beetles, I just might look at them and say, hey, those are different species. Because if you don't know the history that they started out as the same species, they're going to look pretty darn different.
And so how do you find that history? If you just show up one day and you see two different beetles?
Well, that's where more detailed genetic analyses can come into play. One of the things we use for animals that works pretty well, doesn't work always for plants or for some other critters, is the ability to interbreed. So if I were to come along and I want to know, gee, these guys look really similar in everything but color.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're the same species and they're just in different environments, and or maybe they've been apart long enough that they've accumulated enough other variations that they no longer mate. If they no longer mate, then we would consider them to be separate species. If they still mate, then we would probably consider them to be the same species, unless, get a little more complicated here.
Let's get more complicated.
If they breed, but their offspring are all sterile, we would still consider them separate species, because then the genes from one population and the genes from the other population, they can never really trade genes back and forth, because anything they made in between is sterile and it's dead end evolutionarily.
Is there like a number of years that it takes for that process to happen?
Depends a lot on the species.
Okay.
So the simple thing is, number one, it takes a long time. It's not something that happens very quickly. But, it's going to happen in something like beetles that have a generation time of maybe 6 months to a year. It's going to happen a lot faster in them than it's going to happen in elephants.
Yeah.
Right, that happens. So it depends a lot on the generation time. And usually when we talk about time from an evolutionary point of view, if we're thinking about species, we tend to think more about generations than number of years or number of months, because
it makes sense.
equalizes things out between species. So, you have 100 generations, you're probably not going to get different species.
Yeah.
1,000 generations, you're starting to get into the thing there. 10,000 generations, if they've been completely separated, odds are pretty good.
So
There's a lot of randomness in that process, so you can't predict it down to,
But that randomness is intentional.
generation,
Isn't the randomness intentional though? Like it's
No,
not at all.
no. So there's all kind of randomness in this. So I've been talking about, the idea that evolution isn't completely random, right? But there's all kinds of randomness. For example, just real simply, when a male and a female get together and mate with one another, right? Half of the male's genes go into the sperm. Half of the female's genes go into the sperm. Which half they get, it's not entirely random, but there's a big random element to it, right? Basically, you get half of each set of, so your genes, for animals, they come in pairs, right? And when you form sperm or eggs, those pairs split. And each egg gets one of one chromosome and one of the other. Humans have 23 chromosomes, different animals have different number of chromosomes. But how those chromosomes get mixed, you might get the left one from this one and the right one from that one, and there's all this randomness that goes in there. So you can't necessarily guarantee what traits are going to get down to the next generation because of that random element. And so because of that, it depends a lot. In terms of the environment selecting, right? If you have an environment that's selecting a lot on reproductive characteristics, you're going to get speciation faster than if you have an environment that's selecting on non-reproductive characteristics. Because again, if we come back to that criteria of being able to interbreed, right? If our beetles are being selected on color, and that has nothing to do with their ability to reproduce, we're probably not going to see much change in their ability to form fertile offspring together. If, on the other hand, you have selection on something like the shape of the genitalia, it might not take much evolution at all before the males from this population can't mate with the females from that population because their genitals don't fit.
Damn. So is that common, though, with beetles? Is that an example? Has that happened?
Yeah, they're insects in general, because they have exoskeletons. Their organs that they use for fertilization are hard. And so small changes in shape can prevent males from fertilizing females.
So
or vice versa.
So in that situation, like they separate and over a couple generations, 100,000 generations, whatever, they change, right? They're not able to breed with each other. How has that not happened with humans?
Depending on who you listen to, people will say it kind of has. I mean, when we look back at the evolutionary history of human beings, we see that we do have different subspecies and things like that. And subspecies is kind of this area in between.
Are you talking about like Neanderthals?
Like Neanderthal, like Homo habilis, things like that.
But don't we still, like, aren't there some people with Neanderthal genetics in them still?
Exactly. So there was interbreeding. So we never got to the point where we weren't able to interbreed at all, although there probably were some difficulties with it. Again, trying to go back in time and, figure out the mating rituals of Neanderthals versus Homo sapiens is difficult. But the fact of the matter is the percentage of Neanderthal-type genes in the human population is pretty small. And so odds are that was a fairly rare event that happened, enough to get those genes in there, but not enough to really change the structure of our evolution.
Do you think, what advantages did Homo sapiens have at the time for them to end up winning, I guess?
I'm not an anthropologist, so
You don't think?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I mean, when you look at it just from an objective point of view, Neanderthal actually had a lot of advantages over us. Probably the biggest thing that I've seen is that our social structure gave us an advantage over them, that we tended to form larger social groups and cooperate more within the social groups, and that probably had a big influence. Neanderthal actually had a larger brain size than we do.
So they were smarter?
Yeah. Well, brain size and intelligence aren't necessarily related, but, they tend to be.
Were they as good with tools?
That's what I'm going to have to punt on. I'm not that versed in that sort of thing. But yeah, I think I have read some stuff that seems to show that Homo sapiens innovated more frequently, that Neanderthal tools tended to be more stable over long periods of time, whereas we had more innovation and things like that.
It's interesting.
But it's difficult to talk about that sort of thing because, when we look at, for example, the different races of humans, there have been arguments made in the past that, that was the beginnings of possible separation. There's a lot of pushback against that these days. I'm not going to express an opinion one way or the other than to say that people have thrown these ideas out. I don't think they're terribly well justified with the evidence we have available to us now. But one of the things that has prevented humans from separating into multiple species, well, I'll give you two things.
Okay.
Number one, we're a violent race, and we tend to kill off things that aren't like us. So other species may have started developing and weren't able to make it. But I think the bigger issue is the fact that we travel a lot, we move a lot. And the more you move between populations, the more you mix those genes and the harder it is to speciate. So we have something called gene flow. And I'm going to get into one of the other mechanisms of evolution now.
Okay.
So, natural selection is one way that evolution can happen. If you have variation in heredity, and you have two populations that are isolated from one another, which is kind of what we were talking about with our beetles before, that's when speciation can happen, right? But if you have a lot of movement back and forth between those populations, well, the red ones over here are going to carry their genes over and put them in the blue population. The blue ones are going to bring their genes and put them in the red population, and it's going to prevent that separation over time. In human beings, we move a lot. And that's something we can go back, pretty far in history. We've been moving all over the world. And that helps keep everything closer together and keep things from getting these sorts of speciation. So the fact that we are a cosmopolitan species, we occur on every continent except Antarctica. Well, we have a couple people living on Antarctica, but I don't think there's a breeding population down there.
Yeah. There's a big conspiracy on that one too, but
because we have all that movement, I think it has kept the species from being able to separate. And then again, we go to war a lot.
Yeah.
So anything that really does start to separate is likely to get persecuted and wiped out potentially.
I mean, it's probably
examples of genocide in our history. So
it's probably like a crazy number of like the percentage of like how many times we've been at war and like compared to like peace times. Like it's probably like 95% we're always at war.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers on there, but yeah, we probably spend more of our time not at peace than at peace. I mean, our period right now is actually a period of relative peace.
One of the most peaceful times. Yeah.
Although the Russians are doing their best to change that, but
yeah. Do you think if everyone's moving around now, everyone's living in different continents, everyone's living in different states, I guess, could you say that there could be one race where everyone kind of mixes into one?
There have been people who've projected that in the future, that, if we look 100,000 years in the future, that you're not going to see the racial differences that we see now between people. That's a pretty bold prediction. I don't know if I'm willing to go quite that far, but certainly if we continue moving around and intermingling more and more. And particularly, I mean, even when we look now, the statistics about people who tend to marry outside of their own race, it's fairly small numbers. If that increases enough, then we could see that sort of thing happen.
But it would take like 100,000 years.
It would take a long time. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you tie me down to a specific date on that.
What about
it would take a long time.
Like, what about our feet? Like, we're not even like built to walk on the ground anymore. With like, we need shoes. So how long did that take? Right? Think about that. Think about 30.
I think that's an assumption you're making there. If you go without shoes, you'll be okay. It's more of something we develop over our lifetimes than something that's a genetic trait or anything.
Your feet wouldn't get ripped up. You wouldn't have.
Well, they'd toughen up.
They would toughen up.
If you go barefoot a lot, you get calluses on your feet, right? I mean, that's different from evolution. It's what we call acclimation. Those are changes within an individual's lifetime that help them do better in their environment. So it's something like going barefoot, you develop calluses. Even you can look at people's hands, different jobs. You can tell, somebody's got nice soft hands. It means they've had a white collar job or something like that for most of their life. They got calluses. They're been out working and doing more stuff. And we changed that through our lives. When I was younger, I had lots of calluses on my hand. Now I've been a professor for 20 plus years. I don't anymore. Don't need them.
Have you ever heard of the type of people in the Amazon, like those tribes where they're like have like web feet and they're able to like we gotta pull a picture up because it's crazy what they like. It's almost like they're I don't know, like they do things that we're unable to do.
Yeah, and again, this is where they've got these isolated populations where if there are genetic differences, they tend to accumulate there, and they're not getting. What's the right word here? They're not getting invaded by other traits, and so those tend to become in higher abundance in that trait, particularly if there's a lot of inbreeding. That can also pull things up, but I don't know that about your particular example here.
Yeah, wait, JP, can you look up some of the tribes?
Yeah, I am right now.
It's interesting. No, like, no, but I mean, what would make like a tribe like that to never leave their area? Like, if humans are nomads for most of history, we're all migrating, moving around. But there's just some tribes that just decided we're going to stay here.
Mostly geography would be
like they have all their needs filled. They don't have, there's no reason to leave.
There's no reason to leave if their populations don't get too big. One of the big reasons for migrations is that populations get large in an area, it gets overcrowded, there's too much competition between individuals, and so they leave somewhere else. If they're in an area that's providing their needs and they're not overbreeding, then there's no real reason to leave. And like I say, geography is a big thing. So, when we look at other species.
Yeah, like that.
They aren't webbed feet, but they're for climbing trees.
Yeah, they're able to climb trees. Amazon tribe that eats monkeys. Wow. Different type of person. That's a dog. That's interesting.
I'm not going to comment on that because I don't know anything about that.
Yeah.
I don't know which website you're looking at, so reliability is always an issue.
What's the website?
Daily Mail.
Yeah. Yeah. Where do you get your news from?
Mostly NPR.
NPR?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So National Public Radio, for those who don't know the acronym.
So
And there's probably a lot of people that don't know that acronym. I grew up listening to NPR, so I'm kind of familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's like when someone's trying to do like a research paper, what would you say, like, what would you draw the line on? I'm like, okay, you can do a .gov, you can do an edu. I know, like,
you can use as a resource,
like as a reliable resource.
none of that.
None of that? Not a .gov?
No.
No?
The most reliable place to get stuff in science, and this is true in most of the academic disciplines, would be to go to what we call a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Okay, so a peer-reviewed scientific journal. This is how we learn things in science. It's also how we verify things in science. So when I want to publish something, I don't just go post it on a website and it's published.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. I send it to one of these journals. They have an editor who reads it, gives an initial read, decides whether it's appropriate for the journal, and then they'll send it out to other reviewers who are other experts in that area. And they will review it. And they will make a determination. Usually they got three choices. Either it's not publishable, in which case it won't get published. It is publishable, which almost never happens. And then the middle one is, it's almost publishable, go work on it some more and make it better. And that's usually what happens, at least in my experience.
So it's a long process.
I've had many at either end. Ones in the middle are the common ones. And so you improve your paper based on the comments of these other people who are experts. experts in the field. So, for example, my research is largely on spiders and scorpions, so I submit things to a journal called the Journal of Arachnology. They do stuff with spiders and scorpions, and then they'll send it out to other individuals who've also worked with spiders and scorpions, know the science as well, so they evaluate your methods. Did you use good methods? Have you done your statistics properly? Does what you're saying make sense with what they know of the things, and can they make sense of it? And if they can, then eventually it get published. But if they can't, it doesn't get published. So those are the areas that have been vetted. Somebody just goes put something on the web. I can go put anything I want on the web. I can go say crazy stuff on the web. Nobody's checking that.
I've never understood why someone would want to do that though. Like, why would someone want to put something on the web and just like not be true at all whatsoever, or just super like inaccurate, especially with like a .gov. I thought that was like reliable.
Well, .gov is kind of a gray area. So we can use in science, especially if you're doing conservation or things that the government is involved in, CDC, things like that, Center for Disease Control. Then those are kind of considered secondary sites. So you can still cite that stuff because they also have that quality control on them. But if you just go to a .com, there's no quality control on that. Even .edu, the quality control is fairly limited. So I wouldn't trust necessarily something I found on a .edu. I might, if I go there and I happen to know, I've read other papers by this researcher, and so I kind of know their reputation, then I would maybe be able to take that, but I couldn't cite it in a paper.
So if you see a student cite that or use that as a source, do you kind of cringe a little bit?
Not only do I cringe, but I get out my big red pen. And,
He's like, no.
Can't do that, yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit on your research with scorpions? And that's pretty cool.
So, I should have brought one. Oh, well,
So you deal with venomous scorpions and spiders on a daily basis?
Scorpions, yeah. Most of the spiders I deal with. I mean, almost all spiders are venomous, but most of them can't bite us, so they're not at all dangerous. The scorpions can sting you. I've never been stung.
Okay.
They're very easy to handle. It's not that difficult to avoid being stung if you get a little bit of training. I've had high school students come work in my lab.
Oh, that's cool.
And I give them 10 minutes of training, and I've never had one of them get stung either. So it's not, they're not terribly dangerous.
Okay.
And the ones we have around here they're not going to kill you.
Gotcha.
It'd be like getting stung by a bee or a wasp.
Okay.
Generally painful, not something you want to have happen.
That does hurt.
But probably not going to kill you unless you happen to be allergic to the venom.
Okay.
And
Gotcha.
that's always a possibility. So you should always, if you get stung by pretty much anything, take some precautions.
Yes, of course.
What was your research on with that?
So maybe you can pull some of this stuff up on the web. Scorpions, when you expose them to ultraviolet light, they glow. Okay? And this has been known for a long time. It was discovered back turn of this last century.
Yeah.
But nobody really knew why they did it. So what's the function of that trait? And so most of my research with scorpions has been around that idea of what is it that this trait does for scorpions in the real world. And I'll give you scorpion fluorescence is probably the best way to get some pictures to see that. Yeah.
Is
That's actually one of mine.
wow.
That's hilarious.
Beautiful. Is that because of evolution? Do they evolve to that, to have that ability?
Well,
or?
that's what we're testing, right?
Okay.
So when it comes to a trait like this and trying to understand the function, right? That's what you're really saying is this an adaptation that they can use to help them survive, reproduce in the wild? Not every trait is necessarily an adaptation. You could have a trait due to randomness. It's not common, but there are a few that were just like, there's no good function. You could have a trait because it was useful to your ancestors hundreds of thousands of generations ago, but the environment has changed so that trait is no longer useful in the current environment, but if it doesn't hurt you, it'll hang around.
It won't go away.
Yeah, that's actually was one of the initial ideas with scorpions because, at least at the time I started doing my research, it was thought that all scorpions fluoresced, even those that live in caves and things like that, where they're never going to encounter UV light. And so I'm going, well, probably what happened was that this was a trait that was useful when their ancestors, giant water scorpions called eurypterids, cool looking critters. There's none of them around anymore. But they came out onto land and were exposed to UV light. And so they thought, well, maybe this helped to protect them from the UV light. And then now that scorpions are all nocturnal, they don't really encounter that much UV light, so they really don't need to be protected from them. So that is a function today doesn't make much sense.
If they're nocturnal, could they use the glowing to like kind of see in the dark?
Not really. Well, maybe. I mean, they don't glow strongly enough, like in moonlight and stuff, that we can perceive it. But there's a lot of evidence that they can actually detect it. Their eyes are really sensitive, and they have the peak of sensitivity right at the same wavelength of light that they fluoresce at. So I don't think they're going to fluoresce brightly enough that they're going to illuminate the environment around them and let them see it. But they might be able to detect each other with it. So it might be a way for them to see each other at night. Scorpions, not exactly the most social critters, though. As a matter of fact, if they find each other in the night, they're more likely to eat each other than they are pretty much anything else. There's a lot of cannibalism in scorpions.
Oh, nice.
But they might also be using it to do other things. So we started with a series of hypotheses, right? An hypothesis in this case is just a guess as to what it might be doing for them. And my first hypothesis was that they might be using it to attract prey. So, if you turn on a light outside at night, bugs come to it, right? And so the idea is, well, the scorpions are glowing enough that those kinds of critters can see it. Again, their eyes are more sensitive. They're nocturnal organisms. We're not. So the fact that we can't see it doesn't tell us much. It's what the other critters do. And so one of my first experiments I did when I started working on scorpions was just putting out scorpions that had been treated so that they didn't fluoresce, alongside scorpions that were still allowed to fluoresce, and then counting the number of insects that were captured on some sticky paper that they were on. So these were preserved scorpions, because you can't make them not fluoresce, or at least you couldn't back then, and keep them alive. That doesn't work very well. And so did that with the idea that we're going to see if it comes in and says, okay, we would predict then, right, based on the idea, well, go through the logic here a little bit, if scorpion fluorescence functions to lure prey or attract prey, then we would expect that my fluorescent scorpion on the sticky trap, we should catch more insects on that sticky trap than the one that doesn't fluoresce. And we would also predict that there'd be a difference between the new moon and the full moon, right? So during the full moon, we'd expect to see a bigger difference between them. During the new moon, we'd expect to see basically none, because there's no UV light in the environment. So we do that.
What is the percentage of scorpions that are able to have that? The glow like that, yeah, fluoresce.
Almost all.
All of them? Okay.
No, not all of them. Almost all.
Almost all of them. So
Almost
the one
all.
that wasn't
there's been
glowing.
one small group in Europe that's been discovered that doesn't. I think there's maybe 4 or 5 species. All the other species have been looked at fluoresce. But I'll be honest here. This is one of those, how we do science, right? Things can get a little distorted. The way you find scorpions, and the way people have found scorpions for the last 50 years or more at least, is you go out at night with an ultraviolet light and shine it around. And if you have an ultraviolet light, you can make them glow strongly enough that we can see them, and they're really easy to go pick up. The problem is, if that's the method you're using to catch scorpions, you're never going to find the ones that don't fluoresce. So they've probably been undersampled. The ones that don't fluoresce have probably been undersampled. So we've found a few. There's probably more out there. We just don't know it yet because they're harder to find.
That's a good point. Good point. What is so? And then with the spiders, that's not the same thing, right? Not the fluorescent. They don't glow. There's no glowing spiders.
No, well, there actually are some spiders that glow, but that's not my research.
Oh, I'd freak out. Jeez.
They don't glow nearly as bright as scorpions do. Scorpions are the kings of fluorescence. They glow brighter. There are other organisms that fluoresce. Even some birds and mammals have been found to fluoresce. A duck-billed platypus, for example, was recently discovered that it fluoresces under UV light. But it's a real pale fluorescence as opposed to scorpions, that it's a bright green.
Yeah.
They almost look like a glow stick almost. I'm looking at the pictures.
When you hit them with an ultraviolet light, they pop out. You can see them from 30, 40 feet away.
Oh, wow.
Right down over there, because I do my research
Right down the bluffs?
in the Panorama Vista Preserve, down at the bottom of the bluffs.
Nice. So why? Okay, going back to you mentioned the big water scorpion, where they're in the water and they're huge.
I actually just pulled up. I had the size comparison from. That is insane.
Yeah, some of the Europterids
What?
were really big. Now most of them weren't that big.
Yeah.
Most of them were smaller, but yeah, there were a couple of really big ones.
Why were animals back then way bigger than they are now?
Well, in this case, probably because it's aquatic. So being aquatic allows for larger organisms because the water buoys you up and allows you to basically have more weight and still be able to function. An animal the size of one of those Eurypterids on land with an exoskeleton would be so heavy it couldn't move.
Okay.
But under the water it can.
But under the water, wouldn't it weigh it down? Wouldn't it just sink to the bottom?
But the water holds you up too. Right?
Okay.
So the water provides buoyancy.
Okay.
Right. So I can't float in this room, but I can go float in the swimming pool. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Water holds you up. So organisms have that too. So as a general rule, we tend to see organisms in the water can be larger than their terrestrial counterparts. So, for example, crabs, lobsters, things like that are much bigger than insects.
Yeah.
As a general rule. Again, there are some tiny ones out there too. Don't get me wrong, but there are microscopic crustaceans out there.
So, but even land animals though back then, like during the dinosaur age, like was it because of like the oxygen level?
There have been a lot of different hypotheses about that. I don't think any of them is terribly well supported. I think one of the most intriguing ones I've seen actually fairly recently is the idea that as mammals developed and being warm-blooded, number one, it takes a lot more energy. So being big is a lot more expensive. So mammals and birds aren't going to get as big as those slow-moving reptiles were. And then there's competition. So if you're a great big slow-moving thing like Tyrannosaurus rex, right, and there's all these little mammals running around, they're going to get to the food before you can because they can move so much faster and do things. So being big wasn't really good for them in that sense. And as a matter of fact, most of the current stuff about them was that they weren't actually predators. They were mostly carrion eaters. They would go find dead carcasses and eat those because...
Wow. So it's not Jurassic Park. They're not.
Yeah. That's
God, that sucks.
Yeah.
But didn't they have weren't they feathers
like a
on
lot
them?
of our modern carrion eaters, they probably did a little hunting on the side occasionally.
Yeah.
But
They
mostly they're relying on dead stuff.
It's a descendant of a chicken, a T-Rex. Ancestor, yeah. Yeah.
Get it the right way.
Ancestor, yeah. Sorry. And they had feathers.
Yeah, growing up, always saw the scales.
I don't know that there's much evidence that T-Rex itself had feathers, but yeah, a lot of dinosaurs did have feathers. We're finding more and more of them
That's crazy.
that had feathers.
So,
And yeah, the living. I keep back.
No, you're fine. Don't worry about it.
The living representatives of the dinosaur family are the birds.
what a fall from grace. Being a T-Rex and just being a chicken. That's your family.
Yeah, but you could also be a bald eagle, so
True. That's right.
Yeah.
What? Okay.
And there's not like there was a direct descent.
Yeah, no, it doesn't go from their kid wasn't a chicken. But what about so the dinosaurs go extinct, where you say meteor, whatever.
Yeah.
How does life survive after that? I don't get how life continues on after wiping out all the dinosaurs.
Well, because it did wipe out all the dinosaurs, but there was lots of other stuff, mostly smaller stuff, that was able to survive in small microhabitats through the initial shock wave and everything that came down when the asteroid hit. That would be kind of the worst part, that we saw lots of death there. And of course, we have lots of aquatic organisms that wouldn't have been affected very much by that at all, except for the ones right near the site of impact, of course.
Yeah.
Being underwater wouldn't help you much in that case. But, it went around. And so things are living in the soil where they're protected. Things are living in the water where they're protected, even deep lakes and ponds. And so then life then diversifies after that. And that's exactly, when we look at evolution again, come back full circle, we're talking about evolution again. When you have a lot of variation, right, and then it gets hammered by something like what killed the dinosaurs, there's actually been several other mass extinction events, some of them even worse than the dinosaurs. The remaining life starts to move out into new environments. And as they move into those new environments, well, they're encountering now your red tablecloth versus your blue tablecloth, and we start to see them diversify, and we see a bunch of new species develop in, what is evolutionarily at least, a fairly short period of time after the decline of the dinosaurs. Before the dinosaurs were gone, mammals were around, but there weren't that many of them. They tended to be small, nocturnal, because they were staying away from the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were
way bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dangerous. Well, after that, we see the development of much larger mammals. We see mammals moving into daytime habitats. We see their diversification across a whole range of different habitats that they hadn't been able to invade before because they were occupied. You remove the occupants, new folks move in, and then they change to adjust to that new environment. And so
it's almost like a power struggle.
Adaptive radiation.
Yeah. It's almost like a power struggle. There's a
think
top
of
of
it
the
that
totem
way.
pole, one goes down, and then there's a new one. There's a new top of the totem pole. What is you said there was a worse mass extinction. extinction on the planet? What was it?
There was an extinction between the Permian and the Triassic. I'm awful with my geological epics, so.
Better than us.
But after the Permian age, there was an extinction that the estimates are that we lost about 90% of life on Earth.
How long ago was that?
Oh, that would have been, like I said, I'm not great on my geological epics. Pushing in the range of 800 million to 1 billion years ago, somewhere in that range. Long time ago.
Yes.
Well before the dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Dinosaurs 65. That wasn't.
Yeah.
But what happened there?
That's one. Quite frankly, again, it's one of those things. People have tried to pose a lot of different things, and none of them have been really well supported. Again, it's really hard to do research about what happened that long ago. There have been a couple of ideas about that, and actually, even before that, one of the bigger mass extinctions actually happened really early on in the history of life. The first life didn't use oxygen, wasn't able to do photosynthesis, and oxygen was toxic to a lot of it. And then at some point, we had the development of plants that could do photosynthesis, and they started pumping oxygen into the atmosphere, and that killed almost all the stuff to which oxygen was toxic to. So we had an almost complete switchover of living things for which oxygen was toxic to living things for which oxygen isn't necessary, right? You don't get oxygen, you're dead.
So is that a variation, how that just kind of popped up out of nowhere?
Yeah, it's a mutation that happened at some point. And again, far enough back, I'm not going to try and, recreate what happened there or anything like that. That's outside of my realm. I'm not a paleontologist nor a botanist. So
yeah.
That's way outside of what I do. But so at some point we started, and you can see in cores from glaciers and things like that, Antarctica, that there was this drastic change in the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere. So we can see that as an indication of this is probably when photosynthesis started to become a big deal, because we went from being a largely anaerobic environment with mostly microbes. This was, before we really had much in the way of multicellular life or anything like that, that were anaerobic. They couldn't survive oxygen. We still have some of those critters around. There are still microbes that will die if you expose them to oxygen. They live in very, very weird environments where oxygen doesn't get there, deep at the bottom of the ocean, deep under the soil. And we actually have some living inside of our bodies too, because our bodies have anaerobic things. Those are actually some of the things that cause some of your nastier infections. That's why if you get like a puncture wound and it heals over, you can get this area where there's no oxygen, and those bacteria can proliferate in there and give you a pretty nasty infection.
Jeez.
So they're out there and around, but they used to be everything, and now they're this. I don't want to call them trivial because they can be important in a lot of things, but a much smaller component
hiding away
of our biota.
Gosh, it's like, I mean, I know this is probably not going to sound right to you, but to me, it seems like it's a power struggle to me. Like, it just seems like, okay, there's no oxygen. They're everywhere. They're thriving because there's no oxygen. They're about and around. They're everywhere. The second you get oxygen pumped into the atmosphere, they hide. The same thing with the mammals, with the dinosaurs. The mammals are hiding because the dinosaurs are out and around. Dinosaurs go extinct and the mammals take over. But then at what point, though, like, did humans, how does, because this is crazy to me. Like, how does that happen? How does evolution start from there, like the beginning of life, go all the way to humans with, like, consciousness? How does that develop?
Again,
which is crazy.
I'm not going to really go into that because I'm not an anthropologist. I haven't really studied that area. But just as a really general answer to that question is that, remember that, we're moving constantly, right? Things are constantly changing. With evolution, nothing is static. No matter how good something is, it may not be good if the environment changes enough. I'll give you a silly example, right? Gills, great trait if you live in the water. But you throw a fish on the land and it's croaked. It's done, right? So is it a good trait or not? Well, it depends on the environment. The environment changes. What was a good trait can become a bad trait, or a neutral trait, which is probably more common. Trait doesn't matter anymore. So, the traits that are good change over time. As far as, moving into something like consciousness and stuff, it's all really about survival, and even more important than survival is reproduction. There's, the old Darwinian phrase, right? Survival of the fittest. I always like to say, it's reproduction of the fittest. Whoever has the most babies wins. And And that's what the competition is really about. And that's why we see some really cool things. I'm going to come back to spiders for a minute because I'll talk about these things. Everybody knows the black widow spider, right? We're in Bakersfield. You've all seen, right? Where does black widow spider's name come from? Why is it called the black widow spider?
It used to kill the husband. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When they mate, the female typically eats the male after they mate.
Okay.
Not when they mate, after they mate, because if she does before, she's not going to have any babies, right? So, why do the males allow this to happen to them, right? Well, they do because from a genetic point of view, it's actually a good trait. And they've done experiments where you basically allow the females to do their normal thing and eat the male, and others where they basically take a pair of forceps and yank the male out of the web. And they count the number of eggs. And it turns out that females who eat the males, they're able to use those nutrients. They fertilize more of their eggs with that male's sperm.
But
so not only does the female have more babies, but the male has more babies because more of his sperm gets used to fertilize that. So that trait of basically allowing your, I wouldn't want to say they sacrifice themselves because I don't think it's a conscious thing, but, not running away, not,
it's just something they do.
Too much, is actually a good thing in terms of them having more babies. It's not good for them as an individual, not by any stretch. But if you have more offspring, then that trait can increase in frequency in the next generation. It doesn't really matter too much what happens to you. You can have something really bad happen to you, but if it means you have more babies, that trait can still increase in frequency in the next generation.
But there can't be an overpopulation problem, right?
Oh, there certainly can be an overpopulation.
But that's why there's that's why it's they kill each other, right? Other species kill each other, and it kind of balances the.
Well, so there's competition within species, and that's really a fairly large driver of evolution as well, right? And then competition between species is a little bit less, but certainly once we start talking about predation, then we start talking about things like coevolution, where an organism that's a predator develops a new weapon, which allows it to kill its prey more readily. But when it does that, well, it kills off the prey that are most susceptible to that weapon, leaving alive the ones that are least susceptible, so they increase in frequency. And now you've got
they have more babies.
Organisms. Exactly. Now you have organisms that have a trait that resists that new predation quite well. And we see this all the time. It's actually a big problem in the medical field. So probably heard in the news about, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, right? This is exactly what's happening. We develop a new antibiotic. We put it into the population. It kills off most of the bacteria. But any that survive are those that are resistant to it. They start increasing in frequency in the population. Now, next time when you put that same antibiotic out there, it's not as effective.
It's a new variant.
Right? And so, go ahead. So now we've got methicillin-resistant and penicillin-resistant organisms that weren't around 50, 60 years ago.
So it's almost like it's better to let nature run its course almost. Like have the ones fight off the disease, and then whoever survives it.
Antibiotics have saved millions of lives. I'm not going to say we shouldn't have done that.
No, but I mean,
it's good stuff. But we do need to be more cognizant of it. So one of the things that we've learned that we weren't doing early on because we didn't know is that when you go into a population of a bacteria, and you apply a antibiotic to it, there is variation amongst that population. Some of them are more resistant, some of them are less resistant. The longer you apply that antibiotic to the population, the harder it is even on the ones that are resistant. If you apply it long enough, you can kill them all. If you can kill them all, then you don't have to worry about the evolution of bacterial resistance. So when you go to the doctor and they give you an antibiotic for something, the doses we have are designed to last long enough to kill everything off. If you stop taking your dosage halfway through, you're breeding resistant bacteria. So when you get one of those things, it is really important, even though you're feeling better. A lot of antibiotics, I've done this myself. You have 2 or 3 doses, you feel better. I don't need the rest of them. No, don't do that. Take them all because you want to make sure that you're killing everything off so that you don't have this development of resistant bacteria. And in any one individual, it's like, again, we're talking many, many generations. Bacteria go through their generations quickly, but not that quickly. It's probably not going to matter to you too much. But you become this kind of safe harbor that these guys are living in. You pass it on to somebody else. They get exposed to bacteria or to antibiotics again. Knocks off some of those. Each generation that goes through that, they're getting a little bit more resistant. And that's part of why we have problems now with these bacterial resistant.
So we're battling with viruses here.
Yeah.
We're battling, trying to be one step ahead of them.
Yeah.
So how are the viruses able to adapt so quickly, though?
Well, fast generation times.
Fast generation times? They die. What do you mean, like their lifespan's really?
Yeah, their lifespan is really short. For some bacteria, as short as a day.
Wow.
So they're reproducing.
So 100 days is 100 generations. Wow.
Right. And we're going through, a generation, 20 years or so, humans. Yeah, who's going to win that race?
Wow.
Right? we're running way slower than they are.
Because then I think of I think what's going on in China with the COVID policies, how everyone was in lockdown, and now there's all these variants of COVID, and they don't even have a vaccine for those variants anymore. So now they're back out there, and they're all getting it again. Whereas, if you would have just had herd immunity or whatever you call it, I can't even say it right now. Sorry, I can't talk. But if you get that, everyone gets the virus, then everyone adapts to it, right?
Well, some people die, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's always the thing. That's part of evolution, is that some everybody dies eventually, but some organisms die before they reproduce. Those are the ones whose genes don't make it in the next generation. And we can, there are several examples, historical examples. I'm going to, again, because I don't do humans much, so I'm going to use examples from the animal kingdom because I know those ones better. In Australia, back in the early part of the 1900s, they introduced rabbits because the English that were living there wanted to be able to go shoot rabbits. Well, there was no competition. None of the marsupials living in Australia could compete against the rabbits. And so the rabbits' populations exploded. So then a few years later, to try and combat the rabbit populations, they introduced a disease to the rabbit populations called myxomatoma.
Myxomatoma, okay.
Yeah. I think I'm adding an extra syllable in there, but I can't remember which one it is. So they threw this out there, and it was great. It was really good biological control. It killed millions of rabbits, but not all of them. 20 years later, you go and you measure the rabbit population, and they are resistant to this disease.
They can fight it off.
Right. Not only that, but when they look at the disease itself, they found that the disease has become less deadly to rabbits. Wow. And there's a reason for that. And again, it comes back to evolution. Whoever reproduces most wins, right? That's what's going on. So within the disease population, right, they're infecting rabbits. Now think about it this way. If you're a disease and you're infecting a host, and you kill them off in 5 days, what are your odds of infecting another host?
Not likely.
Another one, variant, same species, but it's not as deadly. It kills its host off in 20 days. Which one's going to reproduce more?
The one that kills it in 20 days?
Yeah. The longer you can use your host, the more opportunity
to
you
spread
have
it to other
spread
people.
to another host. So these long incubation times are actually generally fairly good for diseases. There is an exception to that. There are some diseases that are able to transmit better after they've killed off their host. Those ones tend to get selected to kill off their hosts pretty well. But anything that relies on its host being alive to infect the next host in the population, they tend to become less virulent over time. They tend to become less deadly over time. And this is what happened with rabbits. So now the rabbits, basically this disease is kind of in the rabbits, but it's like a cold for us. It doesn't really kill them. It just,
so was
get a little sick and then they get on with their lives.
So was the flu for us originally deadly?
Yeah.
Very deadly.
Probably. Again, we're going back in time, but we can look at things like the Spanish flu back at the end of World War I.
1917.
Came out and wiped out millions of people. Mm-hmm. And Spanish flu is still floating around out there, but it doesn't kill very many people anymore.
Just because it already did it, and we were able to adapt.
Most of the people who couldn't.
Yeah.
And, then over time, it's become less deadly.
But it's just this constant battle. Like it's never going to be like, all right, we killed the last virus. Like the virus is always changing.
Well, the last virus in general, no. But we have successfully eliminated a couple of specific viruses. So, for example, smallpox is no longer out there in the world. The only living smallpox is probably in weapons research laboratories in various countries.
Yeah, polio.
But there's no wild smallpox anymore. They're talking about hopefully getting malaria eradicated here in the next couple of decades.
Oh, wow.
They've had some really big improvements in their ability to do some things with malaria, so they're hoping that will happen. Whether it will or not, of course, time will tell. But
What do you think about CRISPR? I mean, isn't that a solution too? Hopefully, in the future, you can gene edit it.
It's been talked about. We actually do something. It's not quite as fine toothed as CRISPR would be. But what they would do, one of the ways they're combating malaria is they take male mosquitoes and irradiate them so that they're sterile, and then release them back into the environment. They mate with the females; they don't have any babies, and so it reduces the mosquito population.
So that's how you get rid of malaria.
Yeah. So it's one of the ways. There's
one
a
of the
bunch
ways.
of different things they're doing, but yeah, I mean, anytime you're going to try and eliminate something like that, there's not just one tool.
I mean, how many mosquitoes are on the planet right now? I'm sure it's
We're never going to eliminate mosquitoes.
billions.
Yeah.
But you don't think it gets to the point where eventually we can go into someone's gene code and take out a mutation?
They're doing it.
But like at a large scale where it's
So
people.
far, not at a large scale. I know of one case that's been done. Actually, I just heard about another one too, but I can't remember which disease it was, so I'll talk about the first one instead. For sickle cell anemia. I read a case study. They tried it on one patient who was in and out of the hospital most of her life. They were able to go in there with CRISPR and remove the thing. And as of last report, after a year and a half, I think is about when I heard the story, she had no signs of the disease anymore. So yeah, I mean, that's possible. It's also kind of scary. I mean, there's definitely some big bioethics questions with the ability to manipulate genes. I mean, who decides what's a good trait and what's a bad trait? Again, natural selection, it's the environment that does it.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about CRISPR, you're talking about human beings doing it.
Playing that role,
And people have tried that before. The eugenics movement of the early part of the 19th century, which basically said, we should eliminate all of our genetic defectives. And then you go, and what's a genetic defective to you? And some people, the answer was people who have different skin color than me.
So like you're talking about eugenics.
Yeah.
So it can go down that route too.
It has gone down that route.
No, but I mean
Luckily,
with
we pulled back
CRISPR.
from it. Yeah, it could.
That same thing could happen.
That's us, not the technology, obviously.
Yes.
It's a human decision to be made. But the technology, it could be, we decide we want to eliminate specific genes. The thing that really prevents us from doing that is that the number of human characteristics for which we've really done a good job of identifying this is the gene that causes that is fairly small. We don't know. You can't go in and say, we're gonna take out genes that cause, I'm trying to think, let's say obesity, for example. We've identified a couple of genes that are associated with obesity, but did they really cause it? Well, there's usually a complex interaction between the genes and the environment, and not only the genes we're looking at, but with other genes in the genome of the individual. So the idea that you can just go in and knock out a trait, there aren't many that you can do that with. Sickle cell anemia is one of the exceptions to that.
So yeah, we were reading about this the other night. So your genes are already kind of set, but then some of them kind of change a little bit, or they like shift a little bit based off your environment or your living conditions.
Well, your genes don't change, but what happens is which genes are being expressed change. So
what do you mean by that?
Basically, you've got a bunch of genes that have never done anything. So the basic function of genes is to produce proteins in your body. Okay, that's kind of what they do. When we look at somebody's genome, a lot of the DNA is inactive. That is, it's not producing proteins. But when you put an organism into a different environment, they might shift which genes are actually producing. So again, I'm going to go back and talk about animals because I know them better. A lot of fish, for example, if you have them in an environment at a fairly high temperature, they'll produce one set of proteins in their muscles that allow their muscles to move. But if you shift them into a colder environment, they actually change the proteins that they're using because those proteins work better at colder temperatures. And so they can actually modify which genes are actually active based on the environment.
So it just flips a switch on new ones that are not doing anything. You can think of it
that way, yeah. It's like an on and off switch. I'm going to produce this gene and not that one. We do the same thing. Humans do that as well. We have the hemoglobin that you produce is different now than the hemoglobin you produced when you were in the womb. There is a shift that happens at birth that changes fetal hemoglobin, and you stop producing fetal hemoglobin and start producing a more adult version of hemoglobin. So you change which kind of hemoglobin you're producing at those different stages.
What is hemoglobin?
Hemoglobin is the protein in your blood that's responsible for carrying oxygen.
Okay.
So
So
oxygen environments in the womb and outside of the womb, you have a different protein.
okay, now that makes sense.
It's more efficient in the different situations.
So you're okay. So if CRISPR does get to that point where they are modifying someone's gene code, could it flip the switch on something that would never be triggered or turned on
Potentially.
and cause a whole nother problem?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like a game of whack-a-mole.
Causing problems. I think that's exactly what you would be doing if you tried to do that stuff. Personally, my personal opinion, I think it would be fairly unethical to go in and really start trying to manipulate somebody's DNA for reasons other than potentially deadly illnesses and things like that.
So only it would have to be very severe exceptions like cancer. Like if you can get rid of cancer, do it 100%. Do it no matter what. If you
I don't know if I'd say no matter what. I'd want to look at,
what I mean,
because each cancer is different. So
yeah,
you have to look at each one of those, and again, they're probably not those simple kinds of things where it's one gene and you can go knock it out. Those are relatively rare in our genome.
Have you heard
Those
about
the ones that would be most susceptible to being knocked out by CRISPR?
Have you heard of I forgot the name of the company, but they take a what is it, a tumor. They take a tumor out of someone's body and they have it react to the environment, and then they put the tumor back into the body, and then it's like an outside force, so they kill the tumor. Because it's I'm not explaining it right, but it's they basically they take a piece of the tumor out and they make it seem foreign to the body. So then when you put it back into your body, your immune system sees it as something that's not supposed to be there. They fight it off. They kill it off.
Yeah, I have heard stuff like that. There are a couple of different things, and I'm not sure which one you're referring to. So one of the things that they're doing now is they're trying to genotype the tumors, because if they can understand the genes that are being activated in the tumors, they can potentially develop something that would turn those off. Again, CRISPR being a good option for that. And then there are other things that they can do is they can go in and they can put markers into those tumor cells. So they bring it out because you can do a lot more with it outside of the body than in the body. But if they can figure out a way to put some sort of a marker in there, and then they put that marker into your bloodstream so that your immune system reacts to it. Now, if they put those things back and that marker gets propagated within the tumor, it would be able to, your immune system would then recognize it. I haven't really heard of anything that's been done with that. I know it's kind of a theoretical idea out there. And again, we're getting kind of outside of my area, so I don't keep up on that kind of research much. So
we're just talking on the cusp here.
This is a theoretical possibility, but I would see that as being problematic, because what would happen, you can think about a tumor, really. It's another evolutionary thing happening, right? Just between the cells in your body. So typically what's happening with a tumor is that there is something that happens in the cell, either a mutation or an environmental influence, something that turns off their self-regulatory genes. So there are genes in your body that basically tell your cells, hey, don't reproduce too much, right? If you turn those off, the cells start to reproduce like crazy. They increase in frequency in the body. It's evolution, and that's where your tumor comes from, right? So what would happen in this case if I were to take some out, put a tag on them, and put them back in? Well, your immune system would attack the ones tagged first. Probably wipe those out before it did much to the rest of the tumor, right? Because they don't propagate that way. So I don't think that would be a very effective mechanism for doing it. But I'll be honest, I haven't really thought about it that much until you asked me the question. So
no, I was just kind of wanted to see what you thought on it, because I just heard about it. But
yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular technique. Like I said, I've seen it theoretically discussed elsewhere, but whether it's actually been done.
Does diet play a role in anything?
Diet plays a role in all kinds of stuff.
I mean, for the way you eat, right? Can you pass on that? Like, can you pass on the way? I don't know, like a certain diet. Like if you stick to a diet, right? Like if you just.
That's one of those that it's really hard to separate out. I would be very hesitant to say there's necessarily a genetic component to that, because what you choose to eat is largely a result of what you've been exposed to, right? People do tend to eat like their parents, yeah, but is that because there's a genetic thing, or is it because I eat what I saw my mom and dad eating, and so I learned that? It's really hard to separate those kinds of things out. And so my basic thing on something like that is I'd say it's probably more the environment than it is genetic influences is going there. There might be some genetic influences in there. There certainly are genetic influences on your metabolism and your ability to process certain kinds of foods. So we can see stuff like that going on. But in terms of, your food preferences, I would say those are probably not much, if any, genetic component.
How are we doing on time here?
Hour 05.
Okay, I got one more question. What plays a bigger role for someone's phenotype? Would it be the environment or genetics?
There's no good answer to that question.
Do you think there's a little more of something, or do you think you're just going to say 50-50?
Well, first of all, it depends on which trait you're talking about, right?
Just across the board,
So
just broader.
There are some traits that are largely determined by your genes, your hair color, for example, right? Largely determined by the genes. Does that mean we can't change it with the environment? Sure, there's hair dyes, right? So you can change your phenotypic expression of the trait. It doesn't change the fact that your hair is still going to grow the same color it was, right? So that's fairly much a genetic thing. There's not much influence of the environment on it. It doesn't change too many things. Other traits, there's a much stronger influence of environment on. So for example, your weight. That's just something the environment has a huge influence on. Genetically, your body probably has kind of a range of things where you're going to say, genetically, you're probably going to be somewhere in this range of weights. But depending on the environment, you're going to be towards the high end or the low end. If the environment gets bad enough, of course, you die, but that's not here or there. So, there's a much larger influence. There's that kind of that, I hate to use this, but, the classic question of nature versus nurture. Mm-hmm. And I would say the vast majority of cases, the right answer is both.
Okay.
It's nature and nurture.
So you're going to say 50-50?
Again, depends on the trait, but yeah, in general, it takes a lot of research to try and separate those things out.
But with environment, you can kind of change a little bit. Like you said, you can change your hair color. Mm-hmm. You can do it very, I don't know, you can get tattoos. You can look a lot different than what you originally were supposed to look like.
Yeah.
So, your environment is, I don't know, it seems like kind of, I've been on the side of the genes. We've been arguing this. I've been saying genes this entire time. I don't want to say environment, but
no, this has
50-50.
been a discussion for weeks now in our friend group. So,
because I think 50-50 is erroneous. I just don't think something's black and white.
Every time you try and get me to say that, I'm going, no, not really. First of all, it depends on the trait you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And yeah, your genes basically set the arena, right? They set, I'm going to get into a little math here, but they set the space that's available for you to be in. And the environment kind of pinpoints where in that space you are. So some people's genes might put them in this space, somebody else's genes might put them in this space. You get them in the right environment, they may end up looking pretty darn similar. They may have very similar phenotypes if the environment is the right way, even though their genes are fairly different. By the same token, there's been a lot of studies on twins and things like that where, some of their preferences do seem to be the same, even though they were raised in different environments. So the genes certainly have an influence as well. Again, the real answer is they both have an influence.
Yeah.
How much of an influence depends on which trait you're talking about, and a lot on specific circumstances, which are pretty darn difficult to predict.
I'm an idiot, but my prediction probably would say 65-35. Genes to environment. I don't know. I just think the way you react to your situation is predicated off of your genes. I think your environment, you're going to get exposed.
Way, right? Genetically, humans do seem to have a predisposition to develop language, which is a pretty unusual thing amongst other organisms. There are a couple others that have really rudimentary languages, but nothing that's any close to what we do, right? But which language do you speak?
English.
Why?
Because I was raised in
environment.
United States.
Right? If you'd been raised in China, you'd be speaking Mandarin, right? If you were raised in Russia, you'd be speaking Russian, excuse me. So you've got this genetic kind of architecture that you build. So you can think about it like a building, right? Genetics gives you the basic structure of the building. But the paint color, right? All the other little embellishments on that building, environment is going to have a huge influence on those. The height of the building, set. Everything else?
Can be modified around whatever environment it is.
Yeah. So your genes kind of set up the arena that you get to play in, and your environment kind of tells you where on the playing field you're going to be hanging out.
Well, I'd rather be playing for the Lakers than in Minnesota but I don't know that the arena I'm playing in. But
Well, there's one where your genes are going to have a large influence, because if you're not tall enough, you're probably not going to make it in the NBA.
yeah, exactly. And that's like the easiest win, because like, all right, anyone who's 6'11" has a by far way greater chance of making the NBA than
But
if you were
even height
5'8".
can be influenced a lot by the environment, particularly diet, which you mentioned before, right? You have somebody who might have the genes for the capability of being 6'11", but if they're starved for the first 10 years of their lives, they're probably not going to get there, right? On the other hand, if your genes say you can be 5'3", we can feed you till the cows come home, you're probably not going to get much taller than that. Right?
Yeah, you're probably just gonna be fat, 5'3" fat guy.
Exactly.
That would be awful.
So, you know, and be careful about my example there, because it sounds like, you know, your genes are setting a range of heights that you might end up being. Where exactly in that range of heights you end up depends on your environment. So my 5'2" example was basically, that was as high as you could possibly get. You could still get shorter.
Sounds like Danny DeVito. That's what I thought immediately. I actually lied. I got one more question. What do you think about ChatGPT?
Oh, that's what you were saying before. I have heard of that.
Well, Chegg is completely.
Okay,
Chegg's different. Chegg's like
Chat GPT. Okay, I've heard of that one.
Chegg's like a training bicycle.
Yeah.
This is a motorcycle.
Oh yeah.
This is like you can look up
yeah.
anything and it'll just give you 3 pages
so
of
cool.
information.
You know, from being an old guy, educator, you know, I look at that, oh man, that's going to screw things up. It's going to make things a lot harder to do. In particular, my biggest fear for that, more so than, you know, yeah, I'm worried about student cheating and things like that. That's kind of trivial in the grand scheme of things. My big concern is that when you have something that you can go and can do the work for you, where does your innovation come from?
Yep.
Right? Where
Well,
does the
probably
ability
the
to
AI.
think for yourself come from?
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you're using that to do stuff, I definitely get the short-term gains. I can understand that. But long-term, you are shooting yourself in the foot. I think you're not doing yourself a service using those sorts of things, because you're not going to learn the critical thinking skills that doing things like writing your own essay teach you.
Yeah.
You know, and critical thinking skills, that's where you want to make money in the world, you got to have good critical
So it
thinking
separates
skills.
people.
How much stuff you memorized doesn't really matter, right? Especially in these days and age. I can go to Google and find out pretty much anything, right? I do want to check the reliability of those sites, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where the critical thinking comes
Yep.
in, right? Don't just believe what they tell you. But does that make sense? Does that jibe with the other stuff I know? You need to be able to evaluate that stuff. And if you just start taking this stuff and saying, oh, well, you know, ChatGPT gave me the right answer. Yeah, it might have. But if you don't know whether that's the right answer, and you don't know why that's the right answer, and you can't determine whether this answer or that answer, you're going to be in trouble. And so kind of like, you know, if you use a brace on your legs all the time, pretty soon when you take those braces off, you can't walk.
JP, you can attest to that one.
Yeah. I played offensive line at
Right?
BC.
So if you're using something like this to get you through, what's going to happen when you get into the real world and you have a novel problem that ChatGPT can't solve? How are you going to solve that? You don't have the skills because you didn't get that practice that you need to have those skills. And so that's where I see the danger of it. I mean, from a practical point of view, yeah, I got to start figuring out ways to prevent students from being able to use it to write essays and stuff like that.
Got to make them all do the essays like in front of you, just in person.
Which, you know, I would have hated that as a student
That would
myself,
be awful.
because my handwriting is so bad I would have failed because they couldn't read what I wrote. That could certainly happen to some of my students too. I try to be really good about reading handwriting, but every once in a while, you know, you just can't get it.
That is like a skill that a teacher needs to have.
And it's a skill we're losing. And I have to point to I type everything because nobody can read my handwriting.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, the ability to write, even my print, you know, it's just awful.
I'm a little skeptical of
It's
it.
a skill we're losing.
I'm a little skeptical of the ChatGPT because it's programmed by someone. Like they're programming it to say a certain thing. Like it can side with this current issue. It can have an opinion, which is crazy that an AI can have an opinion, and sound like a person, which I don't even know. I mean, I guess it can make dumb people sound smarter. That's for sure. But
Well, it can fix your grammar and things like that. And as doing something like that, if you are using it to help with grammar, help with your writing, and you're paying attention to it and learning from it, it can be a valuable learning tool. Because, I mean, that's what I do when I have students write papers, is I show them where they're making mistakes. I try and explain what they've done wrong, right? and do that. And that, I think, is a valuable learning thing. So it can be used for that purpose. But if you're just using it and you turn it and you don't look at it anymore, you're floating through the system. And again, you're eventually you're going to hit something that is not going to work for, and then you're not going to have the skills to deal with that situation.
But you have all people know, like the human condition, they're going to take the easy way. They're not going to do that.
There is a certain percentage of the population that will. There is a certain percentage that won't.
Yeah, very small that does their actually deliberate research on it.
Yeah.
But all righty. Oh, wait, what?
Oh, no, nothing.
Oh, I thought you said the camera died.
No,
or something.
no, we're all good.
We got a big media team. We got a big production back there. We got
Hundreds of thousands of dollars invested into the camera system and lighting.
We don't want to pay for chairs yet because we're focused on the camera.
Totally.
But thank you for coming on. It's been really interesting to learn from you and kind of just absorb it. I don't know,
Thank
just
you
to
for
listen to
asking
you.
me. I appreciate it, and I enjoyed my time here too.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you later.